Hello, welcome to the 2020 Florida MPJE Boot Camp. My name is Gary Cacciatore. I'd love to give a little bit of background about myself before we start this course. I'll be your instructor throughout this series of videos to help prepare you for the Florida MPJE. My full-time job is as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Cardinal Health. But I also teach pharmacy law at the University of Houston College of Pharmacy, and I'm an adjunct clinical associate professor at the University of Florida College of Pharmacy. I've been teaching pharmacy law part-time or full-time for the past 20 years, and have been offering MPJE reviews in Texas for the past 15 years. And I'm very pleased to announce that we've expanded into Florida and happy to offer this course to help people prepare for the Florida MPJE, just like we've done in Texas for many years. A couple of housekeeping items before we jump right into the course here. We're going to be using the book that I wrote for this course, which is the Ultimate Florida MPJE Review Guide 2020. We're going to be referring to that book throughout the course. We're going to go through that book in detail. It's highly recommended that you have a copy of that book as you go through this course. And you saw that hopefully when you signed up and registered for this course. A couple of disclaimers that I have to give. This course is intended to provide a general overview of both federal law and Florida law, but I don't have any affiliation with NABP or the MPJE, and I have no specific knowledge of the questions that are on the MPJE. If I did, I would not be able to teach this course. So I just try to work through the competency statements that NABP puts out there, and then review the law in the state and also in the federal law to give you the best information I can to help you try to pass the multi-state pharmacy jurisprudence exam for Florida. MPJE and NABP are trademarks of the National Association of Boards of Pharmacies, and this course is not endorsed by or affiliated with NABP in any manner. One other disclaimer or warning, and that is that all this material that we are providing, including these slides, this video and audio recording, and of course the book itself, that is all copyrighted information. It is not allowed to be recorded, reproduced, or stored without the permission of Florida Pharmacy Regulatory Advisors. Okay, so we're going to jump right into the book and talk a little bit about the MPJE and give you some guidance on test strategies and things you need to be aware of when you're preparing for the MPJE. And this starts on page 7 of your review guide. And I think this information is important because it's important to understand how this exam is organized and what it covers. So some basic information for you there on page 7 of the book is, the exam is 120 question items. Of those 120 question items, only 100 of those questions count towards your score. What does that mean? That means the other 20 questions that are on this exam don't count towards your score. They're being sort of pre-tested to see if they're going to show up in future exams. The problem is you don't know which 20 of those are. So you have to answer each question to the best of your ability, not knowing which ones count and which are the 20 that don't count. But I think it's important to realize that because I don't want you to panic if you get a question that seems very similar to a question you got before, because it could very well be that they're just testing out one of those questions. It might have been the first one you got, or it might have been the second one you got. So don't panic and think, well, I must have missed that question the first time because it's a very similar type of question on the same topic. I better change my answer the second time. Better not to do that. The other thing to remember is you got to get a score of 75 to pass this exam. It's not 75%, okay? It's 75 on a scaled score. And what that means is each question on this exam is not worth the same amount of points. They've pre-tested these exam questions and they know some are harder than other ones. So they have what I think of it like a diving competition where you get points for degree of difficulty. So you might be awarded more points if you get a more difficult question correct than an easier question. But the scaled score makes the test reliable and reproducible for different people who take the exam to make it fair. So it's not 75%, it's 75 on the scaled score. If you turn to page 8, And we'll talk a little bit about the question types. Obviously, this is primarily a multiple choice exam. In the past, it was all multiple choice, but they've changed the format of that a little bit. In addition to multiple choice questions, straight up choose the correct answer, A, B, C, or D, they now have what are called multiple response questions, which you see on the middle of page 8. And a multiple response question will have the prompt that says, select all that apply. And they'll give you a list of items, and you have to choose from that list all the correct answers. When you get this type of question, I think it's important to realize there's a high likelihood if you get a select all that apply question, that it's going to take more than one selection. Because think about it, if there's only one selection that's correct, it probably would have just been a multiple choice question. So if you're debating on a select all that apply, I would recommend you choose two or more, because this kind of makes sense from a logical standpoint. Going back to the multiple choice questions, sometimes people ask me, do we have those multiple choice questions, those K-type questions where, you know, choice A is 1 and 2, and choice B is 3 and 4, and choice C might be 1, 2, and 3. There are still some of those questions in there. They've stopped writing those types of questions because they have the select all that apply questions now. But I think there are some older questions that are multiple choice questions that are the K-type questions. And I have heard some students say, I got a lot of K-type questions on the exam. So there's still some in there like that. And those can be as difficult, I think, as the multiple response questions. The third type of question on the bottom of page 8 is an ordered response question. This type of question asks you to put the particular items in the correct order. This is a little bit more difficult type of question. And the way it works, since this is a computerized exam, is you have to drag and drop these items across the screen and put them in the correct order. The very first thing you want to make sure on a question like that is make sure you got them in the correct order, not the backwards order. If it asks for something from the least to the most, or the highest to the lowest, or lowest to the highest, make sure you're not doing it completely backwards, because that'd be an easy way not to get credit for that question. I think in law, the questions that would fit into this category often have a lot to do with time frames, because the law's got a lot of requirements of, you know, you've got so much time to do this, 72 hours to do this, or 5 days to do this, or 10 days to do this. Those could easily be put into an ordered response question, or something with controlled substances, you know, the most stringent to the least stringent, where, you know, Schedule 1 would be the most stringent, Schedule 2 going down to Schedule 5, the least stringent. So those are the types of questions I would expect to see on something like an ordered response question. On the top of page 9, you see a discussion there about federal law versus state law. I think this is really important. And the point is this, and you'll see this when you get your registration packet for the MPJE. It tells you on there that the MPJE does not make a distinction when they ask questions between federal law and state law. You have to answer the question based on the law and the state you're taking the exam for, which in this case would be Florida. So you got to go into this exam thinking Florida law, Florida law, Florida law. That's particularly important for those of you coming from out of state, where, you know, you might be coming from another state. You got to forget the laws in the other state and only concentrate and answer the law according to Florida. Because remember, the general rule is if you got a federal law and a state law, you always follow the stricter law. And only when those two are complete conflict with each other, where you can't follow one without breaking the other one, would the federal law be supreme under the Constitution. That doesn't happen too often. We'll talk about one example a little bit later. But for the most part, you always follow the stricter law. So if the state has something that's stricter, and oftentimes it's the state that has something stricter, federal law may not address it at all, or the state, they'll both address it, but the state law may be stricter. That's the answer you want to provide on the exam. But what's important in this is that you won't see questions on the exam, or at least you shouldn't see questions on the exam that start out with words like this: under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which of the following is true? That would be an invalid question on an MPJE, because you can't answer the question only under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. if Florida, under the Florida Controlled Substances Act, has a stricter requirement, that's going to be the answer. So the question can't be worded in that manner. I want you to keep that in mind when you're looking at study guides and practice questions in particular. A lot of people will write practice questions, and they write the practice questions based on federal law. Nothing wrong with that. It's good to know the federal law. But if the state law is different and stricter, that could be the incorrect answer, even though in your practice question study guide, it might tell you what the answer is under federal law. That would be the incorrect answer if the state law is different and stricter. Speaking of other study guides, there are lots of study guides out there. You know, we hope ours is going to be really helpful to you, particularly with this course. I think the combination of the two you'll find very, very helpful, because it's hard to read through a book. So I thank you for signing up for this course. I hope by explaining what's in the book, you'll get a lot out of this course. But there are the study guides out there. There's lots of sources of practice questions. Nothing wrong with those. I think it's always good to do practice questions, but just be aware that a couple things with other study guides is you might have that issue of the practice question being based only on federal law. So make sure you know that could be the situation. And the other thing I found in several other study guides that I've seen is it's difficult to keep these study guides up to date. And I've seen practice questions. I've seen one practice question in multiple study guides, and I couldn't figure out where they're getting the correct answer from. And it turns out the law changed in Florida in late 2019, and they just hadn't updated the information. And that happens a lot. So it's very difficult to keep these things up to date. The one practice question guide I did want to tell you about, and that's the pre-MPJE I have on page 9. I mentioned that one because that one is put out by NABP. This is going to the NABP website and signing up to take the pre-MPJE. You have to pay to take this exam, but they will actually give you old exam questions that used to be on the exam. I think it's a 40-question exam. If you really want to see what the MPJE questions are like, that's the only official source for actual questions that used to be on the pre-MPJE. So probably well worth the investment to do something like that. The other thing about the questions on the MPJE, they can be very, very particular. And I think this does vary from state to state, because remember, the item writers that write these questions, they're people from the individual state, but they work in conjunction with NABP, and it's a multi-state pharmacy jurisprudence exam. So there are questions that they try to write that lots of states can use. So you might get questions based on federal law, and if the law is not different in Florida, that could be the answer. And we'll talk about a lot of questions like that tend to show up because most states choose those questions because it's a federal law and state laws don't really address it. Things like adulteration and misbranding under the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. You know, HIPAA, even though a state could have stricter rules in HIPAA, that's not very common. So things like that. USP 797, another good example, that, you know, unless a state has adopted something different or stricter, those kinds of questions are going to be used by lots of different states. But there are also going to be questions on the Florida MPJE that are only for Florida, right? Florida's got a lot of specific types of permits, right? And you know, another state's not going to be able to use a question about a specific Florida permit, right? And some states tend to try and pick the oddball things in their state just to make sure, I think, sometimes that people actually read the laws in that state. Florida kind of does that a lot from a reputation standpoint. That makes the exam a little bit more difficult. That's why it's important that you study both the federal stuff and the state stuff. Turning over to page 11, we start a section there of the MPJE competency statements. And these are reprinted directly out of the NABP guide for the MPJE. So this is public information. Like I said, I don't know the questions on the exam, but by looking at these competency statements, I at least know what the topic areas are, right? And so do you. So it would make sense you want to read these competency statements because every single question on this exam is tied to one of those competency statements. They can't just write a question and say, oh, I think people should know this. When people write questions for the MPJE, they have to identify which competency statement it applies to. So it would make sense to read through these competency statements. Some of them are more helpful than others because some of them are fairly specific. Others, the competency statements are written kind of broadly, so it's kind of hard to understand exactly what they're talking about. But I do think it's worth your time to read through these competency statements and say, yeah, I kind of know where that's at, right? But two things on the competency statements I want to mention, and that is not every competency statement will be covered on every state exam. All right, so because every question's got to be tied to a competency statement, if a state wants to include a question and it's unique to that state, they had to kind of get that language put into the competency statement somewhere. I'll give you an example. There's a competency statement that mentions, the pharmacist's role in death with dignity. There's probably a few states where pharmacist does play a role in that. I think the last time I checked, it was maybe like 5 to 7 states that had some type of death with dignity statute that involved where a pharmacist could fill a prescription to help, for a patient to end their own life, basically. If your state doesn't have that, then you're not going to get a question on that, right? And Florida, for instance, doesn't have something like that. So I would have to expect to see a question on that. The other thing, though, is just because you read something in the competency statements, you might think, oh, well, Florida doesn't address that anywhere because the terminology may be different. So I'll give you an example where they may use the term collaborative practice. And at the time I wrote this book, Florida didn't have a specific law on collaborative practice. This book is already out of date because in the 2020 legislative session, Florida passed a Collaborative Practice Act. But that didn't mean you wouldn't get a question on that before that. Why is that? Because Florida did have medication therapy management rule, and that was done with a protocol. Immunizations even is a type of collaborative practice. So collaborative practice is kind of a general term that may be used, and the Florida terminology may be a little bit different. So just be careful about terminology. Sometimes it doesn't match up exactly in the competency statement as the way that the particular state words that particular topic area. Speaking of new laws and things like that, I mentioned Florida passed some new laws in 2020. You don't need to worry about those because the new laws that passed in 2020 will not be showing up on the MPJE anytime soon. And even if they do show up, they're probably showing up just as a new practice question to be tested out. So it takes at least 6 months and even a year or more before those questions will show up. And even though the law passed in Florida for that and some other items as well, the Board of Pharmacy is still drafting the rules for those. And it's not likely they're going to be asking the question until the detailed rules are worked out. So you don't need to worry about, I think, new laws and new rules from 2020. I think anything from 2019, is something you should be concerned about. That's why it's good to have the most up-to-date book possible. Speaking of that, we have updated the book since it was published. So if you haven't done this already, you should go to our website, which is on the bottom of the slide there, floridapharmacylaw.com. Make sure you download our update and corrections document. There's some things in there where there's a couple typos we corrected. Other things are just updates of things that changed that we thought were significant. And also some things we just tried to clarify things because we didn't think they were worded correctly. So I'm always trying to give you the latest information, and that's a free download on our website. Once a month I try to update it if there's anything new. So before you take your exam, I definitely would go through the update document and particularly correct any of the typos that might exist or something that was incorrectly put into the book. Okay. With that, we are going to jump in to Chapter 1, which is a collection of federal laws, mainly the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, and then a couple of the miscellaneous laws. But the main focus is on the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And this is covered in the MPJE competency statements. And I think it's an area that can trip up a lot of exam takers because it's not an area in actual pharmacy practice that you worry about too much. Adulteration and misbranding of drugs is an interesting concept, but it's very rare for FDA to come into a pharmacy and charge someone with adulteration or misbranding. It's happened before in some egregious cases, obviously. But for the most part, we'll talk about a misfilled prescription that might be misbranded. It could also be adulterated. But when those things happen, you don't really worry about it. You worry about, did I harm my patient? Is the board of pharmacy going to take action against me? You don't start thinking, oh my gosh, I've adulterated or misbranded a product, right? But these things are known to show up on the MPJE exam because they're in the competency statement specifically. So we try to focus not on the complete Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That's the whole area of law. There are entire courses on food, drug, and cosmetic law. We try to focus on the areas that are listed in the MPJE competency statements that are likely to be on the exam. And we do that by looking at those competency statements. So we start out on page 21 with a little bit of history. In my actual course, when I teach pharmacy law, I have an actual textbook, which is a lot more pages, obviously. I find the history of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is very fascinating, and we go into a lot more details on these things. For the review guide, I only put the ones that I think may even come up and in what context they may come up with. So the act was passed in 1938, and it's been amended several times. So the first major amendment, and this one is known by its name, is the Durham-Humphrey Amendments of 1951, because those amendments to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act really gave us our separation of two classes of drugs, over-the-counter versus prescription. And I think it's important not so much to remember the name or what year it was. I would hope they wouldn't ask you that, but you never know. What's more important is they want you to know that, the legal classification of drugs. Is it OTC or is it RX? And they're going to expect you to know that. And they're going to expect you to kind of know the tricky ones, right? Like certain insulin products are technically OTC and certain ones are prescription. Certain OTC products in a certain dosage form, like ibuprofen, 200 milligrams is OTC, but when you get up to 800 milligrams, it's a prescription, right? So those kind of ones that it varies or is a little bit tricky are the ones that generally will show up on the MPJE because they're a little bit different, right? Don't forget oddball things like medical gases, like medical oxygen, is technically a prescription drug. Now, does that mean it has to be dispensed in the pharmacy? Usually not. In most states, that's the one drug that they let other facilities actually dispense or distribute. But medical oxygen without being a quote pharmacy. And Florida allows that as well. They don't have to be pharmacies to do that. So oddball things like that will show up sometimes. You'll see what I just talked about, the OTC versus RX, shows up in the middle of page 21 under a study tip. I try to include study tips throughout this guide to kind of emphasize things that are important, and also to try and help explain things a little bit, and also things that I found over the years that are tricky and that students have a hard time understanding, right? So I think the study tips are really important. Obviously, the whole content of the review guide is important, but I think you should pay particular emphasis on those study tips because they're trying to hammer home a point that I think is particularly important for the MPJE. On the bottom of the page, you see the Kefauver-Harris amendments of 1962. That's the amendments that put in the requirement that a drug not only be safe, but also has to be effective, right? So before that, a drug only had to be safe, that wasn't going to harm anybody. It didn't have to really do what it said it was going to do. But by 1962, after there were some issues with thalidomide in other countries, they decided we better put a requirement that the drug actually does what it says it's going to do. So that's the efficacy requirement that was put in. On the bottom of page 21, I included the PDMA, the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987. It actually went into effect in 1988. This act did a lot of things around illegitimate supply chain. So it put in requirements for a pedigree, which those laws have been replaced now with the track and trace we'll talk about in a moment. So what comes up under the PDMA most frequently has to do, it tried to start to regulate a little bit drug samples, prescription drug samples, because there was a big problem with drug samples weren't being regulated, and there were just way too many of them, and they were getting into the legitimate supply chain. People were reselling them and making money for what were supposed to be free samples from doctors' offices. There were doctors were selling them to pharmacies and things like that. So the PDMA tried to take care of all that by requiring record keeping for samples, and physicians have to sign for those samples and things like that. The most important part for a pharmacy perspective, which is what I hope they would focus on for the MPJE, is it really says that pharmacies, in particular community pharmacies, you really shouldn't have, for the most part, prescription drug samples in your pharmacy. And there's a study tip on that on page 22. You can read through that. There's always exceptions to the law. And as we go through this course, you're going to find I'll be emphasizing, make sure you know the exemptions to the law or the exceptions to the law. Because a lot of times the law is fairly simple, but it's understanding all the exceptions to the law that they like to test on. So even for the samples, there are exceptions. If the pharmacy is part of a charitable organization, they can have samples. And sometimes hospitals can get permission to store samples on behalf of doctors who work in the clinics and the hospitals. Oddball things like that. Also, make sure you read the distinction in Florida. Florida makes a distinction between samples and starter packs. A starter pack is intended to be sold, and you can't have those in your pharmacies. So make sure you know the difference between a starter pack in Florida. It's not the same as a free prescription drug sample. The other thing that the PDMA did, it pretty much banned the importation of prescription drugs. Later laws were passed that modified that and said, well, we're going to allow some importation of drugs if states want to do that and they can show that it's not going to injure patients and it can be done safely. And no state's been able to do that. However, several states have passed laws to allow importation of drugs from Canada. And one of the states that's done that is Florida. So that law has passed in Florida, but it's still sitting with HHS, which FDA is under HHS, as you know. So it's still waiting federal approval to implement that plan. So you'll see later on, Florida has an international pharmacy permit. It's not really in effect yet because that permit was put into place because of this import law that passed in Florida. But until the federal government approves Florida's plan, and a lot of people think Florida might be the first one that actually gets approved, I'm not so sure, we'll see. That law really is not in effect, but that goes way back to the PDMA as well as the anti-importation law. All right. Then there's lots of other amendments that I don't cover in the review guide that I don't expect would be on the MPJE. So next one that I have in the book is on page 23, and that is the Drug Quality and Security Act. And it's actually one law, but it's got two major parts. The first part was the Drug Compounding Act, and the second part of this is the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, better known as the DSCSA, which is our track and trace law. So two kind of separate topics were passed as part of the same bill. The Drug Compounding Act was passed by Congress in response to the problems we had with a compounding pharmacy called the New England Compounding Center, or NECC, that you may have heard about, which was compounding but non-patient specific drugs, and was shipping them to clinics and other places all over the country, and they had a contamination. And I think, I don't know how 70 or so people around the country died from infections, and it became big news nationwide in pharmacy. So Congress reacted by passing, and this was out of a pharmacy, right? But they were non-patient specific. So Congress reacted to that by passing the Drug Compounding Act, which created a new class for these types of facilities. Because these types of facilities, you know, claimed to be pharmacies and they were only doing compounding, but yet it was non-patient specific. So was that really compounding or was that manufacturing? FDA would have said that's manufacturing, but they didn't really take any actions to close these facilities down. They kind of relied on the states, and the states didn't really do it because there are some legitimate needs for these types of facilities, you know, particularly when it's drug shortages and hospitals can't get certain sterile products that they need, they would turn to these types of facilities to get these products. Well, now all of those types of facilities are highly regulated, and they're called 503A facilities. And the 503A is referring to a section of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I'm sorry, those are 503B facilities that they created. 503A is a section of the Drug Compounding Act that was the traditional pharmacy compounding that always existed, right? So if you're a regular pharmacy and you are compounding based on patient-specific prescriptions, you are a 503A facility, and under 503A, even FDA says that's part of the practice of pharmacy, that's not manufacturing. And they go so far to even say that even some anticipatory compounding, you can do a little bit in advance, even before you get the prescription, under certain conditions, that they didn't want to interfere with that. But what they said was, if you're creating sterile products in a non-patient specific manner, that's a 503B facility, which is called an outsourcing facility, the new terminology they came up with. If you're doing that, you'd have to be licensed with the FDA as an outsourcing facility, and they are subject to good manufacturing practices and treated more like a manufacturer. All right, and they may or may not be pharmacies, depending on how the state laws want to license them. Florida has chosen to license them with pharmacy permits. Because ironically, if you're not doing patient-specific prescriptions in a 503B facility, many states say you're not a pharmacy, even though FDA requires a pharmacist to be on staff at a 503B facility. We'll get to how Florida treats that later on. But you definitely need to know the difference between a 503A regular pharmacy doing compounding and a 503B facility that's doing sterile products in a non-patient specific manner. Now, the Compounding Act is much more complicated than that, and FDA has issued many, many guidance documents on how pharmacies can stay into the 503A side of it, and what states can do to regulate it, and which products, and which chemicals and products can be used to compound, which ones can't be done. And there's a whole issue about memorandums about understandings with the states that's very controversial right now. This guidebook and this course, that's beyond the scope of what we have to get into here. But if you go to the FDA's compounding site, they have a specific section of their website about compounding. You can read through all the guidance documents that FDA has put out there. Very controversial area, which within pharmacy, and legally much more complicated than we have time to get into. Okay. The second part of that act is the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, and this is the track and trace law. And I put together kind of a nice summary for you there of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. This law was being implemented, or still being implemented actually, over a 10-year time period. So it was passed in 2013 and will be fully implemented in 2023. And the idea was to eliminate counterfeit drugs in the supply chain. When it's fully implemented, every bottle that you get, unless certain drugs are exempt from this, so, but if a drug is, in most standard oral solid dosage forms are subject to the law. Each bottle that you will get will not only have a lot number on it, but it will have a unique serial code for each bottle. So every bottle will have its own unique serial code, and a 2D barcode that you could scan. And when you scan that, it will go to a database and tell you that that is a legitimate product that came from the manufacturer, and it tracks this drug as it made its way through the supply chain from the manufacturer to the wholesaler to the pharmacy. And it tracks this all electronically through what's called transaction data. And you'll see in the book on page 24 what's in the transaction data. There's things called the transaction information, the transaction history of where the drug's been, and a transaction statement that says basically that you purchased this product from an authorized or licensed person. So it really tightens the drug supply chain to get rid of, hopefully, counterfeit drug products. There are some obligations for pharmacies, and I would imagine that's what they would want you to know. And I covered that on page 25, and that's, you have a duty to investigate and properly handle when you get a product that's what they call either suspect, and suspect means it doesn't look right. You have concerns with it, basically. And then if it's suspect and you determine that it's actually an illegitimate product, then you have additional obligations. And you can see those obligations on page 25 in letter E, 1 through 3. If you identify an illegitimate product, you have to notify FDA with a special form, FDA form 3911, and then notify your trading partners that, hey, you know, if you got a bottle and the print looks funny on it, and you ran the serial code and that wasn't a legitimate bottle from the manufacturer, that's probably a legitimate product. Even stolen product falls into the category of illegitimate products. So it could have a legitimate serial number on it, but if it was stolen or went outside of the normal supply chain, that would have to be reported to FDA as well. And also remember, if you are further distributing products, you have to meet the DSCSA requirements for providing this transaction information. So that could be problematic for some pharmacies. So just think about that if you have to distribute products to another pharmacy or something like that. Don't forget about the DSCSA. All right, let's turn over to page 26 and talk about a little bit about adulteration and misbranding. Most violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are one of two things: adulteration and misbranding. So these are on the MPJE competency statements, right? And they can be a little bit tricky with the way they ask these questions. So like anything in the law, you got to read the definition. So I put down the definition of what adulteration is, and I put the definition of what misbranding is. So read through it, but in summary, adulteration of a product, if it's adulterated, means something happens, so we're going to question the cleanliness of the product, or the strength of the product, or the purity of the product. Okay, so it has to do with cleanliness, strength, and purity. Whereas misbranding of a product has to do with statements or the labeling of the product. Any statement that's false or misleading about the product, on the labeling, something's wrong with the packaging, if it's not packaged correctly, would cause it to be misbranded. All right. But read through all the specific definitions, and I think what you'll see, like under adulteration, you'll see number 6 and number 7 are talking about the strength or the quality or the purity. And number 6, it says if it purports to be in an official compendium. Well, if it purports to be means if it states that it is. So, and that would be an official compendium would be USP probably. So if the product says it's thyroid USP, by having the USP in the name of the product, you are making a statement that it meets the USP compendial standards, right? So if it doesn't, if its purity or strength doesn't meet those standards, it's adulterated. And USP's got standards, you know, it can fall, you know, maybe down to 95% of the strength or something like that. But if it falls below that, it's going to be adulterated. But even if it's not claiming to be a USP standard, number 7 covers any type of product where the cleanliness, the strength, or the purity is not that which it's on that it says it is. Because it says if it's not a compendium and its strength differs from, or the quality falls below that which it represents. Well, what is that which it represents? Pretty much that is whatever's on the label. So if it says it's 200 milligrams on the label, but it's only 100 milligrams in the bottle, that would be adulterated because its strength doesn't meet the standards or the purity that it's supposed to be. But what is it also in that case? It's also misbranded. Why? Because the label is now false or misleading. It says it's 200 milligrams and it's only 100 milligrams. So a product could be adulterated or misbranded when it comes from the manufacturer, sure, right? More than likely on the MPJE, they might talk about how could a pharmacist misbrand or adulterate a product. And the best example that comes up a lot is, you know, you misfill the prescription. So you put the label on the bottle, not the manufacturer, and you label it incorrectly for what's in the bottle. You might have filled the prescription. The label may be correct. The prescription might have been for amoxicillin 500 milligrams. But when you filled it, you get it misfilled, and it was misfilled with amoxicillin 250 milligrams. All right. Is it adulterated or misbranded? Well, I think everybody can see it's misbranded because it says it's 500 and it's 250 in the bottle, right? So the label is false or misleading. But in that case, it's also adulterated. Why? Because the strength or purity is not accurate, right? It's below that which it represents on the label. And I don't think it even has to be just below. If it's a higher dosage, the strength is, it's not the strength it's supposed to be, right? So anytime there's something to do with the dosage or the strength, be careful. It's often going to be not just adulterated, not just misbranded, but it could also be adulterated as well, particularly when it has to do with the strength of the product. Okay, and the study tip covers that on the bottom of page 26. Make sure, again, that you read those study tips. All right. Let me go back 1 minute to misbranding, because misbranding, the general thing is false or misleading in any way whatsoever. But then number 2 on the bottom of page 26 and go over 27, notice what that says. It says, it's a prescription drug and the manufacturer's label fails to contain the following information. So this is the manufacturer's label, the bottle you got from your wholesaler that's sitting on your shelf at the pharmacy. This is not the label when you dispense the drug, okay? That's a major difference, okay? But what they're telling you here is that this is the required information on the label of a prescription drug when it comes from the manufacturer. And if you look at that, and you look at item J on page 27, it says adequate information for use. Well, where is the adequate information for use on a prescription bottle that's sitting on your shelf? That is the package insert. So if you're wondering why do those bottles come with that little sticky stuff on it and have the package insert attached to the bottle? Because technically, if they don't, the product is misbranded. So if that package insert falls off in the wholesaler's bin and you put it on the shelf without that little package insert, it's sitting on your shelf misbranded in violation of federal law. That never happens, right? You know, you would think in this day and age we would move away from actual physical package inserts, and FDA's been trying to do that, but it's still required to be. It has to accompany the product when it's sent to the pharmacy. But that's adequate information for use. The other thing to remember about this is the kind of list you got to memorize for the MPJE. And this is where it gets difficult for people, I think, because in practice, do you look at bottles when they come in from your wholesaler and check to see that all the label meets all these requirements? No. I mean, you expect drug manufacturers to know what goes on their label and not have misbranded products, right? But on the MPJE, they're going to ask you, you know, what's required on there. Expiration date, that RX only is required to be on there. One thing you won't see on there, actually, it's not required, and we'll cover this a little bit later, is notice NDC number is not technically required, is it? It's not on the list. And we'll cover that a little bit later. And then going over to number 3 on page 27, OTC products can also be misbranded, and they have required elements on their label. You've seen the OTC drug facts label, right? There's certain things that have to be in that drug facts label, and those are listed for you on page 27. Are inactive ingredients required on an OTC drug label? I don't know. Guess what? Look at the list. It is inactive ingredients. They could ask weird things like that. So again, you don't worry in your practice of an OTC, you know, not being labeled correctly. You assume the manufacturers do that correctly. But on the MPJE exam, you got to know the required elements on the label for prescription drugs from the manufacturer, OTC drugs from the manufacturer, and then when you dispense a prescription drug, what does the state require to be on the label of the dispensed product? Because the way this works legally is a prescription drug is required to have this information. The adequate information for use is not for the patient. That's for the physician or the pharmacist. That's the package insert. It's got all the indications, the drug interactions, and you know, the pharmacokinetics and all stuff that a pharmacist and maybe a physician can read. That's not intended for the patient, right? So when you dispense a prescription drugs, it becomes exempt from these labeling requirements. because it was ordered by a physician and dispensed by a pharmacist, it can be dispensed without all this information, but it's got to be labeled according to what state law requires. And we'll talk about what Florida requires on that label. And that's something else you're going to have to memorize, is the required elements on the prescription label. But make sure when you're taking the exam, you don't get confused about the labeling of the prescription product versus labeling of when you dispense a product. They're two different things. Okay, and if you'll notice over on page 28, we're going to talk a little bit about the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, which is the child-resistant container requirements. And if you dispense a product that's required to have that, and all prescriptions are required to have it, unless certain exceptions are made, that product becomes misbranded because it's part of the packaging. So it's not just the labeling. Remember the packaging as well. Okay. The next section I call special warning requirements. And these are just a kind of a collection of things that have always kind of shown up on the MPJE. It's in the competency statements. It talks about, special warning requirements for certain products, right? I can remember many, many years ago when I took my MPJE, there was a big focus on, there's special labeling requirements for Ipecac syrup, for poisonings. And if you look that up, and that's on page 29, it's still in the review guide. The reason for that is the citation there, the 21 CFR 201.308. That's because there's a federal regulation that requires specific warnings for when these products are sold, right? So you have to provide these warnings. Now, if you look up that regulation, all around it, 201.309, 314, 322, what we found was there's lots of special warning requirements. So we tried to put more of them into the review guide because technically, you're supposed to know all these special warning requirements. So I would focus on that one, things that seem more common, like the OTC pain relievers you see on the bottom of page 29, even salicylates, number 11 on page 29. There's a warning that's got to be on about Reye syndrome. And also an interesting requirement that retail containers of pediatric aspirin, which is 1 1/4 grain, can't be sold in a container of more than 36 tablets. I never knew that, but that's in the federal regulation. So because it's a federal regulation, it's a good question that every state, can use. So it's a good thing to know. All right, so I would just read through those kind of special warning requirements. And then if you turn over to page 30, I call these additional requirements about OTC drugs. And the first one's about tamper-evident packaging. So just, I think everyone kind of knows this just in general, but all OTC drugs, of course, there's some exceptions for some dermatological products and others, and throat lozenges. But for the most part, most over-the-counter drugs have to be sold in tamper-evident packaging. This goes way back to when there's somebody tampered with some Tylenol. There was some Tylenol poisoning. So that's why you have those difficult to get into, where you can see if somebody opened a package of an over-the-counter drug. And then number 2 and number 3 on page 30 talk about repackaging. The first one, number 2, talks about repackaging of OTC drugs, and number 3 talks about dispensing as a prescription. So let me talk a little bit about repackaging of OTC drugs, because I think a lot of people don't realize that when you repackage a drug, be it RX or OTC, but here we're talking about OTC, the repackaging of a drug product is generally considered FDA manufacturing. So pharmacies generally are not licensed FDA repackagers and can't repackage drugs. Now you might be thinking, wait, Dr. Cacciatore, pharmacies repackage drugs all the time. They do unit dose packaging, they do blister packaging for long-term care patients. You're absolutely right, and it's a technical difference here. And one of the reasons I like to call those things pre-packaging, because the position FDA takes with this is that a pharmacy can repackage products if it's going to be for their own use, and you're going to use it to dispense to your own patients. So putting things into unit dose in a hospital, putting things, repackaging things into convenience packages or blister packages for long-term care patients. We'll talk about customized medication packages a little in a minute. That's another type of that is all the practice of pharmacy. That's okay. But what you can't do is you can't repackage an over-the-counter product and then sell that product commercially to other people. Maybe it comes in a bottle of 50 and the patient wants to buy 20. You can't take 20 out of the OTC product and put it in an amber vial and put the name of the drug and then sell it to the patient. Even if you met all the OTC labeling requirements and put a drug facts label on there, I don't think you could do that and put it and sell it to someone in a commercial transaction, because now it's interstate commerce, and I don't think you could do that. So what you could do, if somebody wants a smaller quantity of an OTC product, if the doctor ordered it, just get a prescription for it. You can dispense OTC drugs as a prescription. Maybe because the dosage is different, or maybe because they want to go higher than the OTC recommended dose. As long as you got a prescription for that, you can do that. Or maybe for the quantity is different. They only want to get 20 out of the OTC bottle. You're really not legally allowed to sell a smaller quantity to somebody else. So number 3 talks about that. If you get a prescription for an over-the-counter product, once you do that and you treat it as a prescription, however, you got to treat it as a prescription. So if the doctor wrote no refills, even though it's an OTC product, you can't refill it, right? Now you can always tell them to go buy some more on aisle 3, but it might be a different package size or different quantity than they need. But just don't get into the trap of thinking that you can actually repackage products and then resell them to other people. You really can't do that as a pharmacy. Okay, the next section on page 30 is about recalls. FDA's got classification of recalls. I think you need to know these classifications. So make sure you read through class 1, class 2, class 3, realizing that class 1 is the most serious type of recall because it says it can cause serious adverse effects on health or death. Okay, so class 1 recalls will go down to the pharmacy level. You'll be pulling stuff off the shelf. And class 2, not quite as serious. And class 3 not likely to cause adverse health consequences. There's a study tip there. I don't think they would ask you about this, but it's just kind of one of those anomalies in the law that that FDA technically has never had the authority to order a drug recall. But you might say, Dr. Casturi, they order drug recalls all the time. Well, they don't order the drug recalls. They usually they request the companies to perform a voluntary recall. And most companies, if FDA says, we think you need to recall that drug, most companies are going to do that, right? Because if you don't do it, they do have other enforcement mechanisms they can take. They can come in and seize the product from your warehouse, right? That would be a bad thing, right? So you notice a lot of drug recalls you get at the top of the notice. Sometimes it says voluntary recall. Well, they can actually say that legally because technically they are doing it voluntarily. Now, in an oddball situation that something happened recently, because of the opioid crisis, as part of a big opioid bill that was passed by Congress, they did give specific authority to FDA to order recalls, but only for controlled substances, which is kind of weird because usually you think of DEA being the one that deals with controlled substances. But for recall purposes, the FDA can now technically order a company to recall a product, but only if it's a controlled substance, which is kind of an oddball thing if you think about it. Okay, on the bottom of page 30 and over to page 31, a little bit about advertising and promotion of drugs. Here we're talking about prescription drugs. The focus here should be on how these rules apply to pharmacies and pharmacists' advertising of drugs. And it's not something you see very often, but these rules were written, back a long time ago when more people actually paid cash for their drugs. And the question came up, and it actually was kind of a famous legal case about, can a pharmacy advertise the price of prescription drugs? Because you're both dispensing the same drug, but one pharmacy wanted to advertise it's cheaper at my pharmacy. And what FDA said was, you know what, yes, a pharmacy, even though they're not the manufacturer of the drug, if they advertise and they use the name of a prescription drug and they're advertising and they advertise the price, that is considered FDA regulated advertising. But FDA said, it actually falls into a category that FDA calls reminder advertising if it's just advertising the price of the drug. But FDA said, you know what, if pharmacies are doing this and they're only doing it to advertise the price, and they meet these certain conditions, we're going to exempt them from meeting the FDA requirements. And those conditions are listed for you on page 31. And that the only purpose is to provide information about the price. You only provide the name of the drug, the strength, the dosage form, and the price. And you don't make any claims about any therapeutic uses of the drug. If you did that, you'd fall out of this exception. So if you meet those exceptions, you can advertise the prices of drugs, but only that information, that limited information. I have seen pharmacies, get warning letters from FDA when they stepped out of this area and they started advertising that they compound. You can advertise that you compound certain prescription drugs, but you should only just mention the name of the drug, the fact that you compound, and you can advertise the price. What you don't want to do is start making therapeutic claims that you compound bioidentical hormones and they can be used to treat X, Y, and Z. The pharmacies who did that did get warning letters from the FDA saying you can't make those types of claims about your compounded drugs. Oh, the other thing I forgot to mention about advertising is who regulates it, and we already talked about it. FDA regulates prescription drug advertising. They do not, however, regulate over-the-counter drug advertising. Over-the-counter drug advertising is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC. So you always should know who implements the laws that we're talking about. That would be an easy question you don't want to miss. And if you think about it, that makes a little bit of sense because the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, regulates household products, and they do all advertising. They regulate to make sure that all advertising of household products are not false or misleading. So it could be tennis shoes or it could be over-the-counter drugs, right? So over-the-counter drug advertising, FTC, Federal Trade Commission, prescription drug advertising, FDA, and if pharmacies are going to do it, if they follow these rules on page 31, they're not going to be subject to those FDA requirements. Okay, let's talk about drug information, and starting with patient package inserts and a couple other things on page 31. I think this one's difficult for particularly those of you that just graduated or graduated in the last 5 to 10 years even, because you've grown up in a world where pharmacists and pharmacies provide drug information with every drug, right? Our computer systems print out, counseling information and how to take this drug, and it's always stapled to the bag, and some states require that as being mandatory when a drug is dispensed. But a lot of the rules around drug information and getting information to patients were implemented slowly, like starting in the 1970s, and because a lot of them were based on federal requirements, not state laws, and those federal laws and rules still exist. So therefore, they make good questions for the MPJE because every state has to follow these, so every state can use these questions, right? So the first ones are patient package inserts. Well, we talked about what a package insert was already, right? A package insert is information how to use that drug, but for the pharmacist, for the doctor, for prescription drugs. But what FDA said was many years ago was, look, there's certain drugs, and we think it's particularly important for patients to get information about how to use this drug properly. These are drugs that have some serious side effects, or it's important that they take it the proper way. So by federal regulation, they said, okay, for these classes of drugs, we're going to require every time these drugs are dispensed that a patient package insert be given to the patient. And FDA often says we don't regulate the practice of medicine and we don't regulate the practice of pharmacy. For the most part, that's true, but sometimes their regulations are so specific that they do require pharmacists to do certain things, and this is one of them, right? So this is why it's a good thing that can show up on the MPJE exam, because it's about the product. Remember, FDA regulates the product, but because it's about the product and it's when it's dispensed, it affects the practice of pharmacy. So these products that require patient package inserts, it's really only progesterone, progesterones used to be on there, estrogen products, and oral contraceptives. So that's why when you dispense oral contraceptives, inside the little container, there's a little patient package insert because it's required by federal law. And estrogen products, the same thing. If you get a large bottle of an estrogen product, the manufacturer is supposed to supply enough of the patient package inserts. So if every time you dispense a single prescription out of that large bottle, you got to give the patient package insert. So make sure you know the difference between a patient package insert, which is intended for the patient, and a package insert, which is part of the required labeling that goes to the pharmacist. If you fail to provide a patient package insert to a patient for a drug that's required, an estrogen or a contraceptive, what have you done? You've misbranded that drug, right? That product, because it's required information, required part of the labeling of that particular drug. The federal rules on this are very specific and unusual, because they don't say it's only when the drugs are dispensed to outpatients. The rule gets very specific and talks about even inpatients and institutionalized patients are required to get a patient package insert. And what it says is they have to get it prior to the first dose and every 30 days thereafter. In practice, I don't think this really happens, but it does happen on the MPJE exam. So know what the law says is supposed to happen, even if it doesn't really happen in practice. So theoretically, before a patient in the hospital got an estrogen product, you'd have to run up to the room and give them the patient package insert, or the nurse would have to give it to them before they got their first dose. Or if a patient in a nursing home is on it routinely every 30 days, you'd have to give that patient a patient package insert. Again, theoretically, that's supposed to happen. If you ask you on the MPJE, that's what's supposed to happen. Okay. Medication guides are similar to patient package inserts, but they're different because there's not a regulation that says, okay, for these drugs, a medication guide is required. A medication guide, when the drug is approved, or sometimes after it's approved, they'll add a medication guide later on. It's the same concept. FDA said, look, on the bottom, page 31, they tell you the criteria of when they're going to require a medication guide for a drug. And it's got, if it can prevent serious adverse effects, if it has serious risk relative to the benefits, or it's very crucial that the patient follow instructions carefully. Those are the types of drugs, and sometimes there's entire drug classes that require medication guides. But it's required information, and actually the text is negotiated usually with the pharmaceutical company of exactly what it's going to say. So if you've got a computer system that spits out general drug information for every drug, it should also print out a separate medication guide for those drugs that require medication guides, because just a generalized one that tells you how to take this medication and what to do if you miss a dose and all the normal patient counseling information may not be sufficient if the drug requires a medication guide. And as I said on the top of page 30, there's entire classes of drugs. Going over to page 32, there's over 1,000 different products and categories of drugs that require medication guides. Things like opioids, right? That's a pretty big class, right? And sometimes there's things like antidepressants, but only in like teenagers and children. Sometimes it's very specific drugs. So there's 1,000 products that require it. So I'm not sure they're going to ask you about a particular one, but just realize what a medication guide is and how it's slightly different from patient package insert. The medication guides kind of go along a little bit with the next section we're going to talk about on page 32, and that is REMS, or Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies. Okay, so it's a great acronym. So what is a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy? So this is something that FDA put into place that says that, we know there's certain drugs that have serious risk associated with them, but yet they are very beneficial. So we want to approve the drugs, but we're going to approve these drugs to be used, but under a REMS program to try to evaluate the risk of these drugs and mitigate the harmful effects of these drugs. So we're trying to have a strategy to mitigate the risk of these drugs, right? That's what the REMS stands for. So it could be as simple as requiring a medication guide, right? Providing information to the patient. Or it could be very complex REMS that require special training for the prescribers, special training for the pharmacists who are going to dispense the drug. They may restrict the distribution of who can dispense the drug, restrictive distribution systems. Pharmacies doesn't really like that usually, but sometimes they do that. It may require that the patient have certain laboratory tests before they're prescribed the drug, and all that's got to be documented. The patient may have to be into a registry program. They may limit the refills. They may limit the how many day supply you can provide. So the best example of that is the iPledge program for isotretinoin, the old Accutane drug, right? Because it can cause birth defects, very serious birth defects. If you prescribe this drug, you got to go into this REMS program, right? It requires the doctors be certified to prescribe the drug. The pharmacies have to be registered into what's called the iPledge program as well. And a responsible pharmacist is in charge of the iPledge program. There's a statement that the patient has to sign that they know all the risk of the drug. They have to have a negative pregnancy test. You can't dispense more than a 30-day supply, only in blister packages. No refills are allowed. So it's the best one example I could give you because it has almost a lot of the elements that are in there. Another one is the STEPS program for thalidomide. I mentioned thalidomide back in the 60s caused some birth defects, but it was later back in the 60s, it was never approved in the U.S., but when it came back, it was approved, but improved with a REMS, right, to make sure that we don't have those side effects with that particular drug. So you should be familiar with those. Turning over to page 34, you'll see a section on NDC numbers. I mentioned this when we were talking about the required elements on a prescription bottle. And surprisingly, I said you didn't see NDC number on there. This is just kind of a weird thing in the law that they can trick you on. That's why I like to include it in there. And that is that just because a product has an NDC number is not an indication that it's an approved FDA product. Okay, because number one, it's not technically required. Now, why do you see it on every drug? Because it's used for reimbursement purposes. It's also used for quality assurance to make sure we got the right drug in there, and even to get the drug into Medicare or Medicaid plans and get the drug listed with the FDA, you have to have an NDC numbers. So for all intents and purposes, it is required, but legally, it's not. And that's why it's not one of the required elements on the label. And what that tells you is, don't let them trick you saying, well, it has an NDC number, it must be an FDA approved drug. That's not necessarily true for a couple of reasons. One, there are some unapproved drugs on the market, and we don't have time to get into details on that, but they are, and they have NDC numbers. And for a while there, I'm not sure if this has changed, there were even some medical devices that had NDC numbers because they were being reimbursed through the pharmacy benefit. So that was an issue. So FDA has moved for medical devices to a unique device identifier. So that problem may be solved, but I'm not sure, to be honest with you. So just realize that an NDC number is not an indication that a product's been approved by the FDA. All right, the next two sections are the FDA Orange Book and the Purple Book. You should be familiar with the Orange Book. The official name is Approved Drug Products with Therapeutic Equivalency Evaluations, and it's the FDA's book for when you look something up in the Orange Book, and it's not even a published book anymore, but it used to be, and it used to have an orange cover. So that's why it became known as the Orange Book. It's their evaluation, even though they got disclaimers on the book saying, you shouldn't rely on this. Everybody relies on it, right? Even some state laws require you to rely on it. When you're trying to find out, is the product I'm going to carry in my pharmacy, is it going to be generically equivalent to the brand name product? Because of course you want it to be generically equivalent. So it's worthwhile probably if you go to the FDA website and just take a look at a listing of the FDA Orange Book, because you'll see there's a reference drug product and it will list all the generic products. And what you're looking for is a rating, and that rating is a two-letter code. And the most important one is the first letter. It's got to be an A-rated product to be considered generically equivalent. All right. If the first letter is a B, it's not considered generically equivalent. You probably don't want to carry that particular generic brand of that product in your pharmacy. The second letter has to do with the dosage form. So for most conventional dosages forms, it's going to be either AA or an AB rated generic. Okay. The purple book does something similar for biosimilar products, biological products. And it has a reference product, and it tells you which other products are biosimilars. And they're called biosimilars because these are, a generic drug is chemically the same product, right? And to make it generically equivalent, we test it to make sure that when you administer it, it has the same effect in the body, the same area under the curve. And that's how you get an A-rated drug in the Orange Book. Well, with a biological product, it's not the exact same chemical entity, right? Because these are large protein molecules, right? They're called biosimilar products. But just because the product is considered a biosimilar does not make it an interchangeable biosimilar. So until a product is considered interchangeable, then if your state law allows you to substitute interchangeable biologicals, you want to reference the purple book. It has to be listed as not just biosimilar, but also interchangeable. The last time I checked, although there's several biosimilars on the market, none of them have attained the interchangeable rating under the purple book. But you get that could change by the time you're watching this video. But last time I checked about a month ago, that was the case. Okay, so we finished the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And I'm going to cover a couple other federal laws, and that will be the end of our first session. So let's cover the Poison Prevention Packaging Act, starting on page 35. This is listed in the MPJE competency statements. It's a fairly simple law, but it's one of those ones that I mentioned where you got to kind of know all the exceptions to the law that make it a little bit tricky. So the first thing is who administers this law. Remember I said like the FTC for OTC advertising. This is not the FDA that administers this law. It's the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC. That would be an easy question that you don't want to miss, right? But the reason for that is because it's a Poison Prevention Packaging Act. It's for any product that could be a poison, not just drugs. But since drugs are included as potential poisons, it does impact pharmacy practice. And that's what we want to focus on. So this is the federal law that requires that all prescription drugs be dispensed in child-resistant containers. That's pretty much the law, right? It applies to all prescription drugs. It only applies to certain over-the-counter drugs. I did not, in the review guide, include the list of over-the-counter drugs. You might want to go to the CPSC website, just Google Poison Prevention Packaging Act. They have got a good PDF document that kind of summarizes the law that I've seen before. I didn't include, but it's mainly like aspirin products, iron, not just iron OTC products, but also iron dietary supplements are actually included. Acetaminophen, ibuprofen. One that surprised me is like imidazoline eye drops, things like tetrahydrozoline, Visine eye drops, and things like that are actually covered, and that's why they're kind of hard to open, right? But not every OTC drug is in there, but quite a few of them are. Also, any product that used to be prescription that went OTC, things like Zantac and things like that, they automatically fall into to requiring child-resistant containers, which is another interesting category. But anyway, that's the law, right? So let's focus on the prescription drugs, because it says all you have to give a child-resistant container, right? But if you look at on page 35, letter C, what are the exemptions? When do you not have to do this? And it says, number one says, at the request of the physician or the patient. Well, that's a pretty big one, right? So if the physician says, I don't want my patient to have a child-resistant container, you don't have to do it. The physicians don't normally do that, but I guess they could. But more importantly, the patient can say that, right? And that's normally what you do in a pharmacy, right? You ask the patient, would you like child-resistant containers or not? And whatever they tell you goes into their profile, so you know every time that patient comes in whether or not they want child-resistant containers. The law is actually funny because it's actually very specific, and they like to sometimes get the specific on it. It allows a patient to make that blanket authorization for all their prescriptions going forward. I call it a blanket authorization. That I don't want any of my prescriptions in non-child resistant because I'm old and I can't open those things, right? If the patient does that, that's valid. It can go into their profile and you're good. But technically, a physician could not give you a blanket one for all of their patients, for one of their patients, even say, Miss Jones, she can't open those bottles. Could you put down in her profile not to give her child-resistant containers? Oh, you'd have to say, sorry, doc, you're not allowed to do that under the law. Again, in real life, that never happens, but sometimes it happens on the MPJE exam. The doctor can only make that designation on individual prescriptions that they prescribe. Maybe they got a checkbox that says child-resistant, non-child resistant. I don't know. But that little difference sometimes is a specific that you need to know. Here's another, and that's in the study tip, by the way. Another little thing that I want to bring up here, I think is very important, and that is this. Sometimes the best thing in practice is not what's required in the law, right? It's one of my favorite study tips for the MPJE, and this is a good example of that. And I'll point these out as we go through this course of things that you thought were true because everybody did it this way. Or even if you didn't think they were true and everybody's not doing it that way, it may be the best practice to do certain things a certain way. And this is a good example of that. And that is, can the patient give a verbal authorization to you, even for a blanket authorization for non-child resistant containers? Is that valid, or does it have to be in writing? Well, the law says a verbal authorization is valid. So legally, that's the answer if it comes up on the MPJE exam. But if I was advising a client, legally as an attorney, and I've done this with some pharmacies that I've worked with, I always advise them to get that in writing, because God forbid something happens 5 years from now or 6 years from now, and something's dispensed in a non-child resistant container, and they're going to say, show me where I said I didn't want that, and you don't have anything in writing documented. It's going to make the legal case much harder for me to defend. It's going to be what they said versus what you said, and you're not going to remember what they said 6 years ago. Probably that pharmacist is not even working at that store anymore. So I would advise it's better to get it in writing, but is it required? No, it's not legally required. Okay. Then you got other exemptions, bulk containers, not intended for household use. A bottle of 500 is not intended to be dispensed to the patient. It can have a screw-on cap, not child resistant. Institutionalized patients in a hospital setting, unit dose, things like that are not, they don't have to be, nursing home patients don't have to be child resistant because somebody's administering the drug to those patients. Even for OTC drugs that are subject to this, the manufacturer is allowed to make one package size that doesn't have to be child resistant, and it's for homes that have no young children. It has to be labeled that way. This packaging is only for homes without young children, so for elderly people to buy and be able to open their OTC drugs. And then number 5 has a very specific list of exemptions for specific prescription drugs. You see on the slide there, it says memorize these. I really suggest you memorize these because this is one of the things that tends to show up on the MPJE. Which of these products is not subject to the child resistant containers laws. And if you look at these, a lot of them make sense just because of the way the drug is packaged. Like it starts out with things like oral contraceptives, right? Those little oral contraceptive packaging, that's not child resistant. So there's an exemption for that. Letter C is sublingual nitroglycerin and chewable isosorbide dinitrate. Why is that one there? It's not so much the packaging for those, but it's just the fact that when you need those drugs, you need them quickly, right? So you don't want somebody struggling to open a child-resistant container if they're having an attack, an angina attack, right? So that one makes sense, I think, therapeutically, right? But look at the details on that one. It's sublingual nitroglycerin, right? Not nitroglycerin capsules, right? So they could get really tricky here, right? And it's sublingual and chewable isosorbide dinitrate, and also 10 milligrams or less. So they could throw in all kinds of weird things of making it, a nitroglycerin capsule, and they can even make the isosorbide dinitrate sublingual, but what if it was 20 milligrams? Then it wouldn't qualify, right? I don't know if they even make a sublingual 20 milligrams or not. Maybe they don't. But on the exam, you never know what's going to happen. Those are the kind of details, unfortunately, for this one that you got to know. And then there's other oddball ones you'll see, like letter K on page 36 is methylprednisolone in packages not containing more than 84 milligrams. What the heck is that? That should be, I've never bothered to add up the dosages, but my guess is that's a Medrol dose pack, right? Think about the packaging of that, right? The little punch through things, those are not child resistant, right? So a lot of these have to do with the packaging, but I would know the very specifics of all of these, to be honest with you. Okay, and that's in the study tip for you as well. Oh, the study tips also says, yeah, make sure you know all the products that are exempt, including the details to strength and dosage forms. Exactly what I just said. Okay, turning over to the bottom, page 36, we got a couple of other just general laws that are in the competency statements I feel like I need to at least talk about a little bit. One is the Federal Hazardous Substances Act. This is a law that requires that anything that's hazardous is going to be marked as hazardous, right? So if you have things in your pharmacy that are flammable, they got to be marked flammable. If they're marked, if they're highly toxic, they got to be marked highly toxic. Causes burns or vapors or products that are considered poisons, right? And you probably won't have a lot of these unless you do some, you have chemicals and you're doing some compounding or something like that. But I included this simply because they mentioned specifically the Federal Hazardous Substances Act. Don't get that mixed up with the Federal Hazard Communication Standard, which this is a different law because this is a OSHA law. It's for occupational safety, so it's really meant to protect workers, right? So what this requires is that employers, and if you're the pharmacy that employs you, you have to comply with this law. And you really think of it more with companies that have chemical products and things like that. But you have to have appropriate labels for those products that are potentially a hazard. If somebody gets it on their hands or gets it in their eyes or something like that. And all these products have what are called safety data sheets. You might have heard the term material safety data sheets or MSDS. The law was changed a few years ago, so to be up to date, the new term is actually safety data sheet. Actually, the MPJE competency statements still use the old term, I think, material safety data sheets, but they're the same thing. And with that, you have to have a hazard communication plan. So just make sure you read through that section just in case something like that shows up on the exam. The other one are some CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, requirements for tamper-resistant prescriptions. And also make sure you read through the CMS requirements for, not in detail, but pharmacy services in long-term care facilities or nursing homes. This is a federal requirement, so it applies everywhere. But Florida has something similar that requires a medication regimen review of patients in a nursing home by the consultant pharmacist every 30 days. Okay, and there's also some specific requirements in there about use of psychotropic drugs in nursing homes that you should read as well. I got a section there about delivering prescriptions by mail. It's pretty much common sense. Obviously, we have mail order pharmacies. It's not it can be done. But what you may not know is that U.S. Postal Service does have, first of all, you can't mail flammable substances or anything that's hazardous or poisonous in the mail. So make sure that if it falls into those categories, you're not mailing those products. But the U.S. Postal regulations, they do have some requirements related to that. You can't mark the packaging to say that there's drugs inside. Probably a good idea, right? If you put even the name of the pharmacy on the outside of the package, particularly if it's controlled substances, it's probably not going to get where it's going to, okay? So it's got to be, DEA says that as well in their regulations, it's got to be plain wrap paper without any indication that there's drugs inside or that it's coming from a pharmacy. Read through the federal tax-free alcohol regulations. If you're using 95% ethanol, which is used sometimes in compounding or in hospital pharmacies, just realize there are some additional regulations and permits you have to get for those products, and they can't be really resold for any reason. Okay, and then the last kind of section is privacy and HIPAA and high tech. I felt like I had to include at least a summary of HIPAA and high tech, because the MPJs always talk about confidentiality. And last time they revised it, I think they added the words "and HIPAA." Well, just with those two words, to me was pretty significant, because I think HIPAA is a lot more complicated than people realize. So I don't know who writes the HIPAA questions for MPJE, or if they specifically ask them based on HIPAA, or it's just more kind of generalities around confidentiality of prescription information. So I thought it was worthwhile including kind of a summary of HIPAA for you. I think what you need to learn there is some of the terminology of that HIPAA uses, right? PHI, which is called protected health information, is kind of like the HIPAA terminology for confidential information. BA is a business associate. So because HIPAA applies to covered entities, most pharmacies are covered entities, and they're required to have a HIPAA privacy officer. And the other thing to know about HIPAA is that, you know, it wasn't intended to impede the regular practice of pharmacy. So what it says is you can disclose a patient's PHI, protected health information, without getting their permission if it's for one of three main areas, okay? And that's for treatment purposes, payment purposes, and the other one's called healthcare operations or operations. So a lot of people call it TPO, treatment, payment, or operations. Some people call it PTO, payment, treatment, or operations. I think of PTO as pay time off, so I usually go TPO when I'm talking about HIPAA. But you should have a general idea what those are. Payment means, yeah, you need to be able to transmit their information to their insurance carrier, right? You don't have to get their permission to do that, because that's considered payment information. Treatment would be you need to disclose their information to another healthcare provider. A doctor calls you and says, "Could you give me a list of all Mrs. Smith's prescriptions, even ones from other doctors that were prescribed to her?" You don't want to say, "Oh no, doctor, I can't do that. It's a HIPAA violation." Of course you can do that. That, you know, the doctor needs that information to come up with their care plan or whatever. That's for treatment purposes. What gets tricky is trying to decide what is treatment and what is trying to market a product, right? Because HIPAA says specifically you can't use somebody's healthcare information to try and market and sell them another product. Now, that doesn't apply when you're counseling a patient on OTC drugs. Yeah, you might end up selling them the OTC drug, but that is really considered treatment, right? But let me give you an example of what you couldn't do. You couldn't take all your patients in your database that are taking prenatal vitamins and send them all coupons for you know, baby strollers, right? Because now you're trying to market something to them, because you know they're going to have a baby, they're taking prenatal vitamins. Maybe you want to come into my pharmacy and buy a stroller, right? That would be an inappropriate use of someone's protected health information to market a product. That's not treatment, right? That's definitely marketing, right? So that one will be pretty obvious. But sometimes what's treatment and what's marketing can be a little bit tricky. And then HIPAA was amended a few years later under the High Tech Act. It made a lot of the requirements of HIPAA applicable to other people who deal with protected information, those business associates that you have to have contracts with. If you're going to send patient information to somebody to do something on your behalf, they have to have a business associate contract or agreement with them. Well, High Tech Act made those protections for patients applicable to the business associates as well. But more importantly, what it did for covered entities like pharmacies was it's got breach notification requirements. So if you do have an unauthorized disclosure of a patient's protected health information, the High Tech Act has requirements that you notify patients about that. And if certain thresholds are met, you may have to notify the local media even, and also report these things to HHS, the Office of Civil Rights is a division of HHS that enforces the HIPAA laws. And some of the enforcement actions for HIPAA violations have been pretty severe. And some of the ones we've seen against pharmacies early on, you know, were like just throwing things in the trash that had patients' names on it, right? You know, they did dumpster diving at many of the, you know, some of the chain pharmacies, and they found old prescription labels in the dumpster of the pharmacy. You can't do that. Anything that's got a patient name on it, even a prescription number and a name, even a prescription number is considered protected health information. So be very, very careful about how you dispose of anything that's got that type of information in your pharmacy. Okay, that's the end of our first lesson. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you on lesson number 2.